The wind carried the smell of dust and sagebrush across the dying land, rolling like a whisper over the plains. The sun hung low, casting a bronze light that turned everything to shadow and gold. Out here in the middle of nowhere, silence didn't mean peace. It meant something had gone wrong. The girl stood over the man sprawled in the dirt, her small hands shaking as she clutched a worn shovel, the wood handle slick with sweat. He was an Apache, his dark hair matted with blood, his chest rising and falling in short, uneven breaths. The earth around him was stained rust red, and the flies were already circling. She didn't know his name. She didn't know what had happened to him. All she knew was that he was dying, and the others had told her to stay away. "He's not one of us," the old preacher had said that morning, his eyes full of something colder than fear. But when the night came, and the others turned their backs, she couldn't. Something inside her wouldn't let her. So she waited until the fire burned low, until the last of the voices faded into sleep. And then she crept out into the wild with the shovel she'd borrowed from behind the church. The desert didn't care about people like her. It never had. The wind tore at her dress, and the ground was so hard it felt like trying to dig through stone. Still, she kept going, because the Apache's breathing was slowing. And she didn't want him to lie there alone when it stopped altogether. He had looked at her once, eyes like burning coals under a fading sun. And even though he hadn't spoken, she'd seen something in that look. Something human. Something scared. The shovel hit rock, and the vibration shot through her arms. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. Her knuckles were raw, her arms trembling, but she kept digging, a few inches at a time. The stars were bright now, scattered like broken glass across the sky. Coyotes called in the distance, and the sound made her shiver. She didn't belong out here in the dark. Nobody did. She stopped to catch her breath and looked down at the man again. His chest barely moved now. The wound near his ribs had stopped bleeding, but not because it was healing. It was because there wasn't much blood left to lose. His lips were cracked, and when he tried to breathe, it sounded like air passing through dry leaves. She lowered the shovel, kneeling beside him. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice trembling. "I didn't know what else to do." His eyes flickered open at the sound, and for a moment she thought he was gone already. Then his fingers twitched, curling slightly against the ground. She reached for his hand without thinking, trying to comfort him. Maybe just to let him know he wasn't alone. His skin was rough, hot with fever. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened suddenly, weak but desperate. She froze. The man's eyes opened wider now, pupils catching the faint moonlight. There was pain there, yes, but something else too. Something like pleading. He tried to speak, but no sound came, only a faint rasp. She leaned closer, afraid to move, afraid not to. "Water," he breathed. The word breaking apart as it left his throat, her heart jumped. She reached for the small canteen tied to her belt, shaking as she poured a few drops between his lips. He swallowed weakly, his throat working with effort. Then he coughed, and she thought for sure that was the end. But he didn't stop breathing. Somehow he was still hanging on. "You shouldn't be alive," she whispered, more to herself than to him. He turned his head slightly, eyes still fixed on her face. It was like he was trying to understand her, to see past the fear in her expression. She didn't know what kind of man he was, or what kind of life he'd lived. Maybe he'd been part of one of those raids the settlers whispered about. Maybe he'd done terrible things. But right now, he was just another soul caught between this world and the next. And she couldn't bring herself to leave him. The night deepened. The wind grew colder, and the stars seemed sharper now. The shovel lay forgotten beside her, half buried in the dirt. The grave she'd tried to dig was too shallow, too small. She looked at it, then back at him, and a strange guilt pressed against her chest. She hadn't been ready to dig a real grave. She wasn't ready to let go of anyone else. Her own memories pressed in like ghosts, the fire that took her family. The preacher who'd taken her in because no one else would. The endless days of chores, of whispers about the wild blood in her veins. She was always the outsider, the one who didn't belong. And now, kneeling beside this dying Apache, she realized they were both outcasts of the same kind, both left behind by the world. A sound broke the stillness, faint, distant hoofbeats echoing across the plain. She tensed, looking toward the horizon. There was no light yet, but she could feel movement, the rhythm of horses traveling fast. Panic prickled up her spine. If the riders came this way, they'd find her with him. The preacher would call it sin. The others would call it betrayal. They wouldn't ask why. They never did. She tried again to pull her hand from his, whispering, "I have to go." But his grip only tightened. His eyes flashed open, fierce now, as if he understood what she was about to do. Then, with the last of his strength, he spoke again, this time more than one word. "Don't. Leave." The voice was hoarse, but clear enough to stop her cold. She swallowed hard, looking at him, at the raw desperation in his gaze. There was something ancient in it, something that made the world feel heavy and old. "I'll come back," she promised quietly. "I swear I will. I just have to." The hoofbeats were louder now, close enough that she could feel them in the ground. She turned her head toward the sound, heart pounding, but when she looked back at him, he was already trying to move. His hand gripped hers like iron, and for a moment it felt like he was pulling her into his world, one of pain and dust and dying light. Then he whispered something she couldn't understand. Words in his own tongue, soft as wind through dry grass. She didn't know what they meant, but the tone was pleading, almost sacred. The riders appeared then, dark shapes against the edge of the horizon, still far off but coming fast. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't have time to think. She turned back to the man, desperate now. "Please, let go," she whispered, trying to free herself. But he wouldn't. His eyes locked on hers. The kind of look that made it impossible to walk away. The wind picked up again, sweeping dust into the air. Her hair whipped across her face. She could hear the shouts now, men calling to each other, guns clanking, the sharp cry of a horse in pain. Whoever they weren't coming to help. Her heart was hammering so hard it hurt. She thought about running, but the Apache still held her. Something deep inside her said that if she left him now, she'd never forgive herself. Maybe this was fate. Maybe the world had brought her here for this one moment to face the thing she feared most. To stand between life and death and decide which one mattered more. The riders were close enough, now that she could see their outlines clearly. The preacher's men, maybe, or bounty hunters. Or worse, the dying man's fingers tightened again. He forced out one last breath of words, something that made her blood run cold. "They'll kill you." 2. She stared at him, the meaning sinking in like a stone in deep water behind her. The thunder of hooves grew louder, shaking the earth. In front of her, the Apache's hand still clung to hers. Refusing to let go, the girl stood frozen between them, dust swirling around her feet. Torn between escape and the dying man who wouldn't release her, and then, just as the first of the riders crested the hill, the Apache's eyes flared open wide, not in pain this time, but with something else entirely. Something that looked like warning. The wind stopped. The night seemed to hold its breath, and she realized too late that the real danger wasn't the men coming toward her. It was what the dying Apache had seen behind her, something moving fast in the dark. Something that made even a warrior afraid. The girl turned her head slowly, the shovel slipping from her grasp as her eyes searched the darkness behind her. At first, she saw nothing only, the dry brush swaying in the wind and the thin trail of dust curling in the moonlight. But then she heard it, a low growl that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. It wasn't a horse, and it wasn't human. The sound was raw, deep, and close. The Apache's fingers tightened around her wrist. His body trembled, but his eyes were locked on whatever hid in the shadows. She couldn't tell if it was fear or recognition that flickered across his face, but it was enough to freeze her in place. The riders were still coming fast from the ridge, and now something unseen was moving closer from the dark. Her mind spun. She had to choose: run toward the men, or face whatever was coming behind her. Neither felt right. She looked down at the Apache again, his lips moving as he whispered something she couldn't understand. His breath hitched, and he coughed, blood catching in his throat. She wanted to help him, but the sound behind her came again, closer now. A shape broke through the brush, low and fast. For a heartbeat, she thought it was a wolf, but the outline was too large. The moonlight caught its eyes, glinting yellow like lantern glass. The Apache raised a shaking hand, pointing at it. His voice came out broken but urgent. "Spirit, not beast," he rasped. She didn't know what he meant, but her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. She took a step back, her hand still trapped in his. The creature stopped just beyond the firelight. It was hard to see clearly, half hidden by shadow, its form shifting with every flicker of the wind. It didn't lunge. It didn't make a sound now. It just watched them. The rider's shouts grew louder behind her, the thunder of hooves echoing across the ground. The girl's eyes darted between the glowing stare in the dark and the approaching men. Panic clawed at her chest. She had no weapon, no place to hide, and a dying man holding her in place. Then the Apache's grip suddenly relaxed. His hand slipped from hers, falling heavy to the ground. She turned back to him, startled, but his eyes were still open, fixed on the shape in the dark. He murmured something again, a single word that sounded like a prayer or a name. She didn't understand it, but it made the air around them feel colder. The wind changed direction, carrying the smell of smoke and horses. The riders were near enough now that she could hear their voices clearly. One shouted to the others, "Over there by the rocks." She dropped to her knees, instinct telling her to stay low. The Apache didn't move. His breathing was shallow, but his eyes remained locked on the horizon. She touched his shoulder, whispering, "We have to move," though she wasn't sure how. The sound of the horses was almost on top of them, when a sudden flash of movement came from the shadows. The shape, the spirit or beast or whatever it was, darted sideways, disappearing into the darkness as fast as it had come. The Apache's head turned slightly, following it. And for the first time since she'd found him, she saw something close to fear in his eyes. A gunshot cracked through the night. Dirt exploded beside her. She screamed and dropped flat, covering her head. The riders were there now, 5, maybe 6 of them, silhouetted by the moonlight on the ridge. Their coats whipped in the wind, rifles glinting in their hands. "Who's there?" one of them called. His voice carried the roughness of whiskey and authority. The girl pressed her body closer to the ground, heart hammering. She knew that voice. It was the preacher. He guided his horse down the slope, his long coat brushing the dust. The others followed close behind. When they reached the hollow where she knelt, he reined in his horse, the animal snorting hard. "Well now," he said softly, his tone sharp as broken glass. "What did I tell you about going near the savages?" The girl didn't answer. She could feel her throat tighten, but her words wouldn't come. The preacher dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the dry ground. He stared down at her for a long moment before glancing at the Apache. "Still alive, is he?" She looked up at him, trembling. "He's hurt. You just disobeyed," he cut in, voice low. "You just threw away everything I tried to teach you." One of the men behind him, broad-shouldered, his face hidden by shadows, spat into the dirt. "Ain't worth saving, preacher." "He's one of them. We should finish it." The preacher nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the girl. "Maybe you're right," her heart lurched. She reached out, putting herself between them and the Apache. "Please don't. He didn't do anything." The preacher's expression didn't change. "You don't know what he's done. His kind raided a farm not a day's ride from here. Killed a family while they slept. You think this one's innocent?" She shook her head. "He was alone. He was bleeding. I couldn't just leave him." Something flickered in the preacher's eyes, a mix of anger and something colder. "That's the trouble with mercy," he said. "It makes fools of good people." He raised his hand slightly, signaling one of the men to step forward. The man cocked his rifle. The girl moved closer to the Apache, her hands trembling. "Please," she whispered, voice cracking. "He's dying already." But before the preacher could speak again, the horses whinnied sharply, startled by something unseen. The same low growl echoed again from the dark. The men turned, rifles raised, eyes scanning the night. "What was that?" one muttered. The preacher narrowed his eyes. "Coyotes." The girl knew better. That sound wasn't any coyotes she'd ever heard. She glanced at the Apache, His lips moved again, whispering the same word as before. It wasn't prayer this time. It was warning. The wind carried another growl, louder now, closer. The horses began to rear, their eyes wide. One of the men cursed, struggling to control his mount. "Preacher," another said, voice tight, "we need to move. Whatever's out there, it's not normal." The preacher looked back toward the girl, his jaw tightening. "Take her," he ordered. "We'll deal with him later." Before she could react, one of the men lunged forward, grabbing her by the arm. She fought back, kicking and twisting. But his grip was too strong. Then the growl came again, this time right behind them. The man froze. The horse beside him screamed and bolted, knocking him sideways. The girl stumbled free, falling to the ground. A blur of movement rushed past her, faster than she could see. Another horse reared up, throwing its rider. The night exploded into chaos, shouting, gunfire. The sound of hooves and fear. She crawled toward the Apache, her hands shaking. He was trying to lift himself now, his face pale, sweat shining on his skin. "Go," he whispered, voice rough and weak. "Run," but she couldn't move. Her body refused. The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it had started. The preacher stood motionless, his face pale in the moonlight. Around him, 2 of his men were down, their horses gone. The brush rustled once more, and then everything was still. "What in God's name?" the preacher muttered, lowering his rifle. The air was heavy, thick with dust and silence. The girl didn't dare breathe. Slowly the preacher turned back toward her, his eyes colder than before. "You brought this," he said, voice trembling with anger. "You brought evil down on us." She shook her head, tears in her eyes. "No, I didn't." He raised his gun, pointing it toward the Apache. "This ends now." She lunged forward, trying to stop him, but before she could reach him, the Apache raised his hand. His eyes opened wide, burning with something fierce. He shouted a single word in his own language, loud, raw, full of pain and defiance. The wind roared through the canyon like a living thing. The preacher's horse screamed again, jerking back. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the narrow hollow. The girl fell to her knees, covering her ears. Dust and smoke filled the air. When it cleared, the preacher was gone, his horse, tearing off into the distance. She looked around, heart racing. The men were scattered, one moaning, the other gone entirely. And beside her, the Apache had collapsed again, his eyes half closed. Breathing ragged, she reached for him, her voice breaking. "What happened? What did you do?" His lips barely moved. "Not me," he whispered. "Them." She followed his gaze toward the ridge. For a moment, she saw movement, again dark shapes, standing against the stars, silent and still. Too many to count, watching. She felt her stomach twist with fear. The Apache's voice trembled as he said, "They've come for me. And now, they've seen you." Her throat tightened. "Who are they?" He closed his eyes, the faintest breath escaping him. "The ones you can't bury." The wind blew again, cold and sharp, carrying the sound of distant drums across the plain. She turned toward it, her heart pounding, the weight of the night pressing down around her. Whatever had started with a dying man in the dirt was no longer just about mercy or fear. It was something older, something waiting to wake. The drums echoed faintly across the plain, carried by the wind like heartbeats buried deep in the earth. The girl sat in the dust beside the Apache, her hands pressed against his chest, feeling the faint rise and fall of his breath. The moon had slipped behind a thin veil of cloud, casting the land in gray half-light. The preacher and his men were gone, some fled. Others dead, but their presence lingered like a curse. She wanted to believe the danger had passed, that whatever had come out of the dark had vanished with them. But the silence afterward was worse than the fight. It was the kind of quiet that listened back. The Apache stirred weakly, his voice barely a whisper. "You should leave." She shook her head. "You won't make it alone." His eyes opened, dark and heavy with exhaustion. "You don't understand? They won't stop now. Not the men, not the others. She didn't ask who he meant. She didn't need to. The shapes she'd seen on the ridge still haunted her mind, those silent figures that had watched without moving. Something in her gut told her they weren't ghosts, not in the way stories meant ghosts to be. They were older than that. I can't leave you here, she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. If I do, they'll find you again. He tried to sit up, grimacing with pain. She helped him as best she could, her arms trembling with the effort. His weight felt heavier than his body should be, like the world itself was pressing down through him. There's a cave, he said after a moment, pointing weakly toward the hills to the west. If we reach it by sunrise, they won't follow. She glanced toward the horizon. It was still hours till dawn. The thought of traveling through that open land in the dark made her chest tighten, but staying here was worse. The preacher could return, or the riders could regroup, and whatever had made those drums might not wait till morning. She found her courage in small steps. She gathered the shovel, the canteen, and the torn blanket from the ground. Then she helped him to his feet, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. Every step was a struggle. The dry earth crumbled beneath them, and each breath felt heavier than the last. They moved slowly through the brush, the moonlight shifting over the land like ripples in water. The Apache leaned on her, his body shaking with fever. She could feel the heat through his torn shirt. After a while, he spoke again. You shouldn't have touched me. She looked at him, confused. What do you mean? When you took my hand, he said, his voice thin, it bound you. My blood. It carries what hunts me. Her stomach twisted. You're saying I'm cursed now? He didn't answer. His silence was worse than a yes. They kept walking until the hills began to rise around them, their slopes marked with jagged rocks and low shrubs. The drums had faded, but every sound made her flinch, the rustle of wind, the cry of a night bird, even her own heartbeat. When they reached the mouth of the cave, it was nothing more than a dark opening carved into the stone, barely tall enough for them to crawl inside. But it felt like shelter, like a hiding place the world might forget for a little while. She helped him down against the wall, covering him with the blanket. He was shivering now, his eyes glassy. She poured a few drops of water into his mouth, watching as he swallowed with effort. The firelight from the torch she lit flickered across his face, painting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Who were they? She asked softly. The ones on the ridge. He turned his head slowly toward her. My people called them the shadows of the old land. They walk where blood was spilled and the earth remembers. They're not alive, not dead. They follow those who cross the line between. She frowned, trying to understand. The line between what? Life and the spirit world, he said. When a man should die but doesn't. She thought about the wound near his ribs, the way he'd looked when she first found him. You were supposed to die, she said quietly. He nodded once. And you kept me here. She stared into the fire, her chest heavy. I was trying to help. I know, he said, his voice softer now. And that's why they'll come for you too. Outside the cave, the wind picked up again, carrying faint whispers through the stones. The fire flickered. She pulled the blanket tighter around him. Even as her hand shook, as the hours passed, she dozed off and on, waking each time to the sound of his breathing or the wind outside. Once, she dreamed she was back at the preacher's camp, surrounded by faces that turned away from her, whispering about sin and blood. When she opened her eyes again, the fire had burned low. The cave was filled with strange shadows. For a moment, she thought they were tricks of the light. Then one of them moved. She froze, her pulse quickening. The Apache was awake too, his eyes open but unfocused. The shadows stretched along the wall, their shapes long and thin. They didn't make a sound. They only drifted closer, like smoke curling through air. Don't move, he whispered. She stayed still, every muscle locked in place. The air grew colder, the fire dimming to embers. She could see faint outlines, now faces, or what might have been faces. Carved from darkness itself, the Apache reached for something under his shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch tied with sinew. He muttered words she didn't understand, tossing a pinch of gray dust into the fire. The flames leapt higher, burning bright blue for a moment. The shadows recoiled, shrinking back toward the cave mouth. Then, just as suddenly, they were gone. She exhaled shakily. What was that? He didn't answer right away. They're restless, he said at last. They want what was promised to them. And what's that? She asked. He looked at her with eyes that seemed older than the earth. Me. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. When dawn finally crept across the sky, she stepped outside the cave and looked toward the horizon. The land stretched wide and empty, the preachers camped miles behind them now, but the faint drumbeat still echoed in her head, steady as a heartbeat. As the sun climbed higher, she gathered some dried brush and started a small fire to warm water for the Apache. His fever hadn't broken. His wound looked worse, and the lines of pain around his eyes had deepened. You need a doctor? She said quietly. He smiled faintly. There's no doctor for what I carry. She didn't argue. Instead, she tore a strip of cloth from her sleeve and dabbed at the sweat on his forehead. After a long silence, he spoke again. What's your name? She hesitated. Clara. He nodded slowly as though committing it to memory. You're brave, Clara, but you shouldn't have stayed. She met his gaze, her voice firm despite her fear. Maybe not. But if I hadn't, you'd be dead. He gave a faint, tired smile. Death isn't always the worst thing. The wind shifted again, carrying a familiar sound, the distant echo of hoofbeats. Clara's stomach tightened. She stood, scanning the plain below. A thin trail of dust was rising in the distance. The preacher's men were coming back. They're here, she whispered. The Apache tried to sit up, wincing. Then it begins again. Clara looked around desperately. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The cave offered cover, but not safety. The riders would find the tracks leading straight to them. She turned back to him. You have to tell me what to do. How do we stop them? He shook his head slowly. You can't stop men like them. But the others? ... maybe. The shadows? She asked. Yes, he said. They follow blood. If the men spill more, the land will rise against them. She didn't understand all his words, but she heard the warning in them. The wind seemed to carry voices again, faint and angry. The riders drew closer, their shouts echoing through the hills. Clara's hands shook as she gripped the shovel she'd carried since that night. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. The Apache leaned against the wall, his breathing labored. If they take you, don't let them touch my blood, he said. Promise me. Yeah. I don't even know what that means, she whispered. You will, he replied. The sound of hooves was right below them now. Shadows moved at the edge of the rocks. She could hear the preacher's voice calling out calm and cold as before. Clara, he shouted. I know you're here. You can't hide from the Lord. She backed away from the cave entrance, her heart pounding outside. The men dismounted. The sound of rifles being cocked filled the morning air. The preacher's voice came again, steady and sure. Bring her back alive. The other one finished it this time. The Apache reached for his pouch again, but his hand trembled too much to open it. Clara caught it instead, clutching the small leather bag in her palm. The air around them grew heavy, almost humming. Clara, he said, his voice fading. Whatever happens now, don't run. She looked at him, terrified. Why not? Because running won't save you, he said. But the land might. Then the first gunshot rang out, echoing off the stone, and the sunlight turned red in the dust. The gunshot shattered the stillness, echoing across the barren hills. Clara dropped to the ground, the sound ringing in her ears. Dust exploded near the cave entrance where the bullet struck the rock. She crawled closer to the Apache, who was too weak to move, but whose eyes still burned with quiet fire. Outside, voices shouted, rough, angry, and getting closer, she could see shadows moving along the ridge below, figures spreading out, rifles raised. The preacher's men were coming from both sides now, boxing them in. The morning sun had climbed higher, glaring against the stone and turning every shape into sharp contrast. Clara's heart hammered so loudly she thought it would give her away. The Apache's hand twitched toward her. The pouch, he whispered. You still have it? She nodded, pulling the small leather bag from her pocket. It felt heavy in her palm, heavier than it looked, as if it carried something more than dust. "What's in it?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "Ash and earth," he said finally. "From my father's grave. It holds what binds me to this land. Use it only when you must." Another shot cracked through the air, and a chunk of stone flew from the cave wall, hitting her shoulder. She gasped, but held the pouch tighter. The preacher's voice carried up the slope. "You can't hide forever, girl. The Lord's patience runs thin." Clara pressed herself against the wall, trying to quiet her breathing. She could hear their boots scraping over rock now, the sound of horses snorting below. The Apache was struggling to sit up again, his hand clutching his wound. His skin had gone pale, and sweat glistened along his brow. "They won't stop," he murmured. "Not until they take what they came for." "What do they want?" she asked. His eyes flicked toward her, full of something ancient and sad. "Me and what follows me." She didn't understand what that meant, but before she could ask, the preacher shouted again, closer this time. "You think that devil beside you can save you? He's dragged your soul into damnation, Clara. Come out and I'll show mercy." The sound of his voice made her stomach twist. He always spoke like that, calm, measured, as if every cruelty was a form of salvation. She remembered the nights back at the camp, how the others listened to him like he was their only truth. He'd taken her in when she had no one, fed her, clothed her, but always reminded her what she owed. Now, she realized, mercy had never been what he wanted. The Apache's breathing grew rougher. "He believes he hunts me," he said, voice weak but clear. "But it's not me the land wants anymore. It's him. The blood he's spilled has called the old ones from their sleep." She looked toward the mouth of the cave. The sunlight outside seemed to shift, the wind carrying faint whispers again. It almost sounded like chanting, far away, yet near enough to feel. The Apache's hand brushed hers. "Clara," he said, "you must decide soon. If he kills me, the curse will pass to him. If I live, it will stay with us both." Her mind reeled. "What curse?" He coughed, his voice breaking. "The one that binds life to death. When you tried to bury me, I wasn't ready to go. You pulled me back. Now the land doesn't know where I belong." The shouting outside grew louder. The preacher's men were nearly at the entrance. Clara looked from the Apache to the pouch in her hand. Her throat was dry. "Tell me what to do." "Trust the earth," he said simply. "She listens when you mean what you say." There wasn't time for more. A shadow fell across the cave entrance, followed by the scrape of a boot against stone. Clara grabbed the shovel and stepped in front of the Apache. Her legs trembled, but she lifted the handle like a weapon. The first man appeared, ducking low with his rifle raised. She swung hard, catching him in the side. He grunted, stumbling back, the gun clattering from his hand. But another man was behind him already, shouting her name. "Clara, stop this nonsense." It was the preacher. His coat flapped in the wind, his wide-brimmed hat casting a dark shadow over his face. His eyes were cold, the same color as iron. He aimed his pistol straight at her. "Step aside," he ordered. "This is not your fight." Clara didn't move. "You don't even know what you're fighting," she said. He gave a tight smile. "Sin never changes, girl. You either burn it out, or it spreads." The Apache shifted behind her, trying to rise. The preacher saw the movement and leveled his pistol at him. "You should have died when I found you," he said. The air around them grew heavier. The wind stopped. Even the horses below went silent. Then, faint at first, but growing clearer, came the sound of drums against low and steady, like the heartbeat of the earth. The preacher hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the hills. "What trick is this?" he snapped. The Apache raised his head. "It's not a trick," he said. "It's judgment." The preacher fired. The shot rang out, but the bullet never hit. It hung in the air for a fraction of a second, then dropped harmlessly to the ground as the earth beneath them shook. A deep rumble rolled through the cave. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the stone walls groaned. The preacher stumbled, his expression twisting with disbelief. Outside, the horses screamed, pulling at their reins. The other men shouted, some running for cover. Clara grabbed the Apache's arm, trying to pull him back as the tremors grew stronger. The air was thick with the smell of dirt and smoke. "What's happening?" she shouted. "The land is waking," he said through clenched teeth. Too much blood spilled, too many graves unmarked. The preacher steadied himself, fury returning to his eyes. "You speak blasphemy," he spat. "I serve God, not dirt." The Apache looked at him, his voice quiet but sharp. "You serve what you fear." The preacher's jaw tightened. He raised the pistol again, but before he could fire, a figure appeared behind him, dark, shifting, barely human. It moved like smoke, wrapping around him without sound. The preacher froze, his eyes wide. The others saw it too. "Preacher." One of the men cried, but before he could reach him, the figure vanished. And the preacher fell to his knees, gasping. Clara watched in horror. His hand trembled as he looked down at the pistol, then at the ground. The shadows stretched toward him, curling like fingers of smoke. "What did you bring here, girl?" he rasped. Clara shook her head. "I didn't bring it." "You did?" He shouted something, but his voice was drowned out by another rumble of the earth. The Apache leaned against the wall, clutching his chest. His face was ashen, but his eyes were fierce. "Clara," he said, "the pouch, open it." Her fingers shook as she untied the sinew and poured the ash into her palm. The wind tore through the cave, scattering the gray dust into the air. For a moment, everything went still again. Then the ground split near the entrance, thin line running like lightning through the dirt. The preacher stumbled backward, staring at it. From within the crack came a low moan, rising in pitch until it sounded like a voice. The shadowy shapes appeared again, many this time, circling the cave like dark mist. Clara felt her knees weaken. "What do I do?" The Apache's voice was faint. "Speak to them. Tell them, you see." She didn't understand. But something inside her, the same quiet instinct that had made her stay with him that first night, told her to listen. She stepped forward, raising her voice against the wind. "I see you," she said. "I know this land remembers. I know what was taken." The air trembled. The shadows seemed to pause, watching her. The preacher turned on her wild-eyed. "Stop that. You're calling them." "They're already here," she said, her voice shaking but sure. The preacher lunged toward her, but the ground buckled beneath him, sending him sprawling. The crack widened, and light soft, golden. Not like fire, but like the heart of the earth spilled from it. The Apache's hand reached out to her. "Clara," he whispered, "the land has chosen its witness." Before she could ask what that meant, a gust of wind rushed through the cave, blinding her. She heard the preacher scream, the horses outside crying out. The light flared so bright it seared her eyes, and then everything fell silent again. When she opened them, the preacher was gone. Only the dust of his coat remained, drifting across the stone. The other men had fled, but the Apache was still there barely. His eyes were dim now, his breathing shallow. She fell beside him, clutching his hand. "Don't leave me," she said, her voice breaking. His gaze met hers. And for a moment she thought he might smile. "You gave me back the sky," he whispered, "but you took the burden too." "What burden?" she asked. He didn't answer. His fingers relaxed, his hands slipping from hers. The faint light from the crack dimmed and faded. Leaving only the sound of the wind, Clara sat there, staring at him, tears blurring her vision. The pouch lay empty beside her, its ashes gone to the wind. The earth was still now, but she could feel something beneath it alive, waiting. When she finally looked up, she saw the horizon shifting, as if the land itself was breathing again. And from far away, faint and slow, came the echo of drums, once more steady, patient, and growing closer. The wind that had once carried dust and gunfire now drifted soft through the canyon, cool and still. Morning light reached the cave entrance again, cutting through the smoke and laying quiet gold across the Apache's body. Clara sat beside him, her hands folded over his, too numb to cry. The land felt changed, somehow lighter and heavier at the same time. The preacher's men were gone, the echo of their horses fading far beyond the ridge. Only the sound of the wind and the faint beat of her heart filled the space now. She stayed there for hours, watching the shadows shift across the stone. Every time she looked at him, it struck her how peaceful he seemed. The harshness that had marked his face since she found him was gone. He looked almost young, like the earth had finally accepted him home. She didn't understand everything that had happened, but she knew what it meant to her. He hadn't been a monster or a spirit of vengeance like the preacher claimed. He'd been a man trying to make peace with the world that broke him. When the sun climbed higher, she took the old shovel again. Her hands were blistered and raw, but she dug anyway. The dirt was dry, filled with tiny stones, and every thrust of the blade made her arms ache. Still, she didn't stop until the hole was deep enough. She gathered wild sage from the ridge and laid it across his chest. Remembering how he had once said, "The earth listened when you spoke from the heart. I don't know the right words," she said softly, her voice trembling. "But I'll remember you. I'll keep what you gave me safe." She covered him carefully, patting down the earth with her palms until the mound looked like it had always been part of the land. When she was done, she sat back and looked at the horizon. The sky was vast and clear, the kind of blue that stretched without end. It felt like it went on forever, but somehow she didn't feel small under it anymore. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of being alone. She packed what little she had left into her worn satchel, the empty pouch. A canteen and the preacher's pistol, which she kept not for killing but for memory. Then she started walking. The trail down the canyon was steep and rough, but the land looked different now, where before it had seemed barren and hollow. She noticed green shoots pushing through the dirt, small flowers growing near the rocks. The world was healing in quiet ways. She couldn't shake the feeling that the Apache had something to do with it. When she reached the base of the hill, she turned for one last look at the cave. It stood silent, the wind moving gently across its mouth like a breath. For a long time, she stood there, trying to remember every detail of that place, the sound of his voice, the flicker of the firelight, the way the earth had come alive around them. Then she whispered a thank you, not sure to whom, and kept walking. By evening, she reached the edge of a dry riverbed that cut across the desert floor. The sun was low, turning everything red and gold. She followed the old path west, where she knew the small trading post still stood, half buried by sand and time. The air smelled of dust and creosote, but it was cleaner somehow, as if the storm that had passed had carried away the old shadows. When she finally reached the post, the place was almost empty. A few horses were tied out front, their reins flapping in the wind. A man at the porch looked up as she approached, his hat tilted low against the light. "Evening," he said, squinting at her. "You come far?" She nodded. "From the canyon." He gave her a strange look. "Not many come from there." "Heard there's ghosts up that way." Clara smiled faintly. Maybe there were. Not anymore. He chuckled under his breath and stepped aside to let her pass. Inside, the smell of coffee and tobacco filled the air. The woman behind the counter stared at her dust-covered clothes and sunburned face, but didn't ask questions. She poured her a cup of coffee and handed it over without a word. Clara sat by the window, sipping slowly, watching the sky outside turn to purple. For the first time in days, she let herself breathe easy. The preacher's voice still haunted her in pieces, but it felt distant now, like an echo from another life. She wondered where the men had gone, whether they had told anyone what happened, but deep down she knew they wouldn't. Some things were too strange, too sacred to explain. As night settled, she noticed a child staring at her from the doorway, a small boy with tangled hair and a curious expression. "Are you the one who tamed the ghost?" he asked suddenly. Clara blinked. "Who told you that?" "Everyone's talking," he said. "They say a spirit came from the canyon and took the preacher away." She looked down at her coffee, smiling to herself. Sometimes people see what they want to see. Maybe it was just the wind. The boy frowned like he didn't quite believe her, then ran off into the back room. She watched him go, and her chest ached in a way she couldn't explain. It reminded her of who she used to be, the girl who ran, the girl who hid from every sound in the dark. She realized she wasn't that girl anymore. When dawn came again, Clara stepped outside. The world was quiet, painted in soft pink and gold. A thin mist clung to the ground, and somewhere far away she could hear coyotes calling. She walked out to where the land opened wide and felt the morning breeze touch her face. It carried something familiar, faint but real, the sound of distant drums again. Slow and steady, like a heartbeat under the soil. She smiled. "I hear you," she whispered. Days turned into weeks as Clara traveled farther west. She followed the trails that led to old towns, helping where she could, staying nowhere too long. Sometimes she told stories to children by the fireside, stories about the desert and the spirits that guarded it, about how the earth never forgot kindness. She didn't speak of the preacher or the cave, only of the Apache who had taught her that even broken things could hold power if you listened close enough. The pouch stayed with her always. She wore it tied to her belt, the leather softened from years of touch. Though the ashes were gone, she swore she could still feel a warmth inside, like a heartbeat. Every time the wind picked up, she felt less alone. Years later, when the trading post had become a town and the tracks of the railroad cut through the hills, travelers still spoke of her. Some said she was a healer who spoke to the land. Others said she wandered the canyons, protecting the graves of those who had no one left. Children grew up hearing her name whispered around fires, calling her the girl who carried the earth's memory. No one ever found the preacher's body. The desert had taken him in the same quiet way it took everything that didn't belong. Some said they saw him wandering near the cliffs, his shadow stretching long in the dying light. Others believed the land itself had swallowed him whole, balancing what had been broken. Clara never spoke of it again. But on quiet nights, when the stars burned bright and the wind moved low across the plains, she would feel something near her, a presence, patient and calm. Sometimes she would hear the faintest voice, like a whisper through the grass, telling her the land was watching, still grateful, still alive. As the years passed, she grew old. Her hair turned gray, her hands weathered, but her eyes never lost their warmth. She built a small home near the edge of the canyon, close enough to hear the wind hum through the rocks. Travelers who came that way often saw her sitting by the fire, looking toward the hills as if waiting for someone. When they asked what she was waiting for, she always said the same thing. "I'm not waiting," she'd say. "I'm listening." And on the day she passed, the sky was clear and wide, the air still as glass. The townsfolk buried her near the ridge, beneath the same sage she had once laid over the Apache's chest. When the wind swept through that place, it carried a sound like a heartbeat, deep and steady, echoing far across the land. Those who stood there swore they felt the ground move, not in fear but in greeting. The earth had taken her back, just as it had taken him. And somewhere beneath the hills, two souls finally rested together. The story of the orphan and the dying Apache became legend, a story of redemption, of the land reclaiming what was lost, and of how even the smallest kindness could awaken something far greater than fear. The desert remembered them both, and when the wind rose each evening, carrying the faint rhythm of drums through the canyon, the people said it was the earth's way of keeping its promise, and it never stopped. Asterisk.